Okay, great. I think we are good to go. One second here. Excellent. Okay. Good afternoon. Hi, everybody. Hope you're doing well, and hope that 2021 is treating you well. Let's get in and do some learning. Just housekeeping. There's a lot of exciting things going on in the shul. There's a wine program on Sunday night. There's something about the vaccine on Sunday afternoon. Next Sunday morning, we've got the great scholar in residence. There's an abundance of things for us to do that are safe for us to do in a safe way, virtually, connect with each other, learn, and create a sense of community. So please take advantage and share with others. I want to spend some time today talking about our Parsha. We're beginning the new book of Shemot and the Parsha of Shemot, which is a huge transition point for us in our learning and in our weekly Torah portion. And in particular, we go from talking about the stories of individual families and individual people, Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Yosef, the brothers, and we transition and we begin talking more about the nation as a whole. But there is one exception to this entire discussion and the entire Parsha, and really not just the Parsha, really what comes from this point all the way through to the end of the Torah, is that while it is true that we're focused on the nation, there's one person's life that we focus a lot on, and that is Moshe Rabbeinu. And what's really interesting about Moshe's life is that we learn about Moshe's life from infancy all the way through death. If we think about it, throughout the Torah tells us nothing about Abraham's personality in the first 70 plus years before God comes to him. The Torah doesn't tell us, Tanakh doesn't tell us anything about what was King David like when he was a child, or any influencing stories there. We know nothing about why God selects these people. We know nothing about Avram. We know about Yitzchak and Yaakov when they're born and their stories, but we only get pieces of their stories. We don't know every single detail. But when it comes to Moshe's life, we really get a holistic view of who was born. This is his childhood. This is his accomplishments. This is the type of person that he is. And it's just interesting to think about this. And we get to the point where, let me share my screen with you here, where at the end of Moshe's life, the Torah describes him in an over-the-top way. Velo kam navi o, this is box 1, be Yisrael. There was never another prophet in the entire Jewish people, like Moshe, asher yida'o Hashem panim al panim, that the Lord singled out face to face. He spoke face to face. So the Torah is very explicit that there is something unique about him. And the question is, what is it that makes Moshe so unique? As we go through his life story, what is it about him that is so unique? So, for instance, just from this pasuk alone, this idea of Asher Yida'o Hashem Panim El Panim, that God knew him or singled him out face to face, there are many interpretations. For example, the Bechor Shor expresses an understanding that what was so special about Moshe relative to God is that Moshe had full comprehension of everything that God told him. Right? Unlike other prophets, when Moshe spoke to Hashem, the message, it wasn't revealed through visions or parables or anything like that. It was direct, and he got the entirety. The Ralbag, on the other hand, disagrees and suggests that the difference was the way in which prophecy took place. We've talked about this before, but when prophecy took place, oftentimes it happens when in a dream. Yaakov dreams when he sees God. When it comes to Moshe, how does Moshe have prophecy? Ralbag says, panim el panim. They spoke face to face. How do you speak face to face to somebody? In the daylight, when you're awake, right? With all of your faculties. He wasn't asleep. So he had a different relationship with God. And the Barbanel suggests even more differently that what does it mean that he has this special relationship face to face? It's like he had, the bat phone from Batman, like you pick it up, calls Batman right away. He had a direct line. He had him on speed dial, God. Moshe could call God anytime he wants, which is different than any other prophet. And the truth is that it's not just in the relationship between God and Moshe where we see that Moshe is just this incredibly capable and talented person, but we see it in the miracles that he performs throughout the Torah. He splits the sea with God's help. He, brings water forth from a rock. He is part of the revelation at Sinai. So many other miracles of the war of Amalek, miracles of the Exodus from Egypt. He's a miracle maker. We know that, right? So that's one thing he has. But there's another piece to him which we don't really talk about so much, which is I would define it as like divine autonomy, that he has the ability, unlike most people, in a sense, to kind of speak on God's behalf. Like, what would God do in this situation, right? What would God say? So he has this ability to actually speak on behalf of God in these circumstances. So, for instance, if you look later in chapter 8, we're not going to read it this week, but in coming weeks, we read here about the plagues, of the plague of Svardaim, the plague of the frogs. I don't know why I couldn't remember what it was called. Vayikra Paro Moshe Aaron. Moshe is called by, and his brother Aaron are called by Pharaoh. Vayomer Ha'etiru El Hashem. Please pray to your God. Vayasar Tzvardaim Mimeni Ume'ami. Please get rid of these frogs. I don't want them. Please. How does Moshe respond? What would be the appropriate response if someone said, "Hey, Rabbi, can you do me a favor? Please pray to God on my behalf." So what would I do? I would say, "Okay, let me go pray to God." But what is Moshe's response? Right, Yomer Moshe Paro on the next pasuk. He says, "You may have this triumph over me, but from what time shall I plead on behalf of you to encourage your people to make it happen?" In other words, you tell me, when do you want it to happen? He doesn't confer with God first. He simply goes and speaks directly to him, and almost on behalf of God. And we see this in other examples too. We see that he drops Hashem's name. He speaks on behalf of God, even though we have no record of God ever saying it. We see that in other plagues, the plagues of locusts and firstborns, where God never gives him instructions or direction or creates the narrative about what's supposed to happen. And instead, he just goes and says, this is what's going to be. So he has some semblance of divine authority. So there's no question that the statement of the Torah is true, that Lo Kam Navi Od B'Yisrael. There's never been a prophet like Moshe. On every level, from his relationship to God, to the miracles, to the divine autonomy, there's no one like Moshe. The question, though, is how do you become like Moshe? How do you become a Gadol? How do you become someone great? If Moshe is, and our forefathers are meant to be role models for us, can we become like Moshe? What are the things that we can do, or what are the things that we can learn from Moshe's life? And in particular, Moshe's life when he is a young man, which is, like I said, not included with anybody else. We don't hear about what Avram was like when he was a young man before God chooses him. So what can we learn from his life that helps us figure out for ourselves, how do we get never to Moshe's level, but at least as close as we actually possibly can? And if we look to chapter 2 in Shemot, there are actually 4 linked episodes that take place. I want to run them through with you. The one first is the story of the Egyptian who hits the Jewish person, then the story of the 2 Jewish people who are fighting with each other, then Paro trying to kill Moshe and his forcing him to flee, and then ultimately Moshe at the well, where he saves Yitro's daughters and eventually is brought into that home as well. And so 4 distinct episodes that take place, truncated about 2 or 3 verses for each one, but the Torah takes the time to tell us about them, and we have to understand what it's trying to do and what are we supposed to learn from it. So let's jump in and actually read those psukim together. So the Torah tells us here in Shemot chapter 2, Vayihi bayamim hahem. It was after some time, Vayigdal Moshe, Moshe grew up, Vayetze el achav, Vayar b'siv lotam. Moshe goes up and sees their pain. Vayar ish mitzri, he sees an Egyptian man, Makeh ish ivri me'achav. He sees an Egyptian man hitting a Jewish man, one of his brethren. Vayifen ko vacho, he looks this way and that. Vayar ki ein ish, he sees that there's no people there, there's no other person. Vayach et hamitzri, vayitmiteu bachol. He kills him and he buries him in the sand. So a few interesting things to talk about. Number one, why does Moshe look this way and that? What does it mean? Vayifen ko vacho. What does it mean? Why is he looking this way and that? Is he hoping he doesn't get caught? What's going on here? This is the audience participation part. Feel free, or not. So one possibility, as you're thinking about this, is, like I said, that he's looking to see which way people are, is anyone watching what he does? There's a very famous idea brought down in the Midrash, I believe quoted by Rashi, that he's looking this way and that to see, is there anything that that is anything good going to come from this man? Kovacho, this way and that. I mean, he's looking into his future, right? He's trying to see, can I kill this man? Is he warranting death? Now, is anybody bothered by this story? What can we learn from this story from verses 11 to 12? What's the takeaway? If we were going to learn a lesson from this, what's the lesson? Is it that you can kill people if they're deserving to die? Is murder ever allowed? What do you think? What's the lesson here? If the Torah is telling us the story, what's it trying to teach us? So someone to say something?
So you have to take great consideration before you do that kind of act. I mean, you really have to think of it and consider all aspects of it before you make that kind of serious action.
True, but is murder ever justified? I'm not sure, but probably not, right? And that's a whole interesting discussion about whether or not he was right or wrong for killing this man.
Right.
But look carefully, look at the language the Torah is using here. I can make it a little bigger for everybody. Hang on. Look at the language that the Torah uses here to describe what Moshe sees. What's a word here in this first verse that is repeated unnecessarily? So twice we see the Torah describe the people that Moshe is going to be with as what?
Kinsmen.
Yeah, his kinsmen, his brothers. In other words, it's unnecessary. If the Torah would have just said, Vayar ish mitzri, after he went out and saw his brothers suffering, he saw this Egyptian man, Makeh ish ivri, hitting an Egyptian man, it would have been obvious that he's what? A kinsman, because that's implied from the verse. But the fact that the Torah here has to tell us explicitly that it is his brother leads many of the commentaries to suggest that we can learn the very first trait from Moshe here, which is that what drew Moshe to this situation was a sense of his justice. Not as what drew him here was that he was a champion of his own people. He saw something bad happening with his people, for his people, and he felt strongly that he needed to stand up for his own people. So this is like Moshe, the patriot, if you will, the Jewish patriot, right? And then the next story, verse 13, the second day, the next day, he now finds two Hebrew people fighting with each other. He says to the offender, why are you fighting your fellow? Why are you, who said you're our boss, right? Are you trying to kill us the way that you killed the Egyptian? We saw what you did the other day. He knows that it's been known, and he's frightened. So what can we learn from this verse, from verses 13 and 14 about Moshe's personality, or why is the Torah sharing this with us? If the first two verses teach us about Moshe being a champion for the Jewish people, what is different in this verse relative to the first verses? Look at how the people are described. How might we expect the Torah to describe these people in verse 13? It would be Shnei Achim Ivrim, right? Ish Ivri Me'achav, in a Hebrew from his brethren. At no point in this entire sentence do we find any word or any reference to the fact that the Hebrews who are fighting are actually his brothers. And so a second character trait that Moshe has as a young person that I think we can learn from is that he is like this ethical judge. It doesn't matter who's fighting. He sees two people fighting. The fact that it happens to be two Jewish people fighting is of no bearing to him whatsoever. He just sees two people fighting, and he sees injustice. Vayomer la rasha. He sees one as being good and one being evil, and so he stands for justice. He's this ethical judge, right? With
the Jews, he took the time to ask a question, though. It seems significant to me.
What do you mean?
So he asked, why do you strike your fellow, instead of jumping in and taking a side?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. The only difference I would say is in the first story, he's literally seeing somebody getting beaten. And the only way to stop that often is like, you have to, how do you get in the way to stop that, right? So the only way to stop it is to kill this man. Whereas in this case, they are simply fighting with each other, and you'd seen they're fighting with each other. So he's but it's a really good point that I think someone could extrapolate, which is that notice the difference in action of how he treats, how he speaks. He is ethically sensitive, but yet does not jump to action the same way he does for his own brothers. No question. I think it's a really good point. But nonetheless, we see two stories, two very different aspects of Moshe's life, right? Now, what does it mean here? Vayomer achein noda hadavar. It is known. What was it that was known? It seems likely that what?
Well, the Egyptian.
Yeah, that he killed the Egyptian. Oh, these people saw me do it. People must know. I think that's one possibility. I think another possibility is not just that that they knew about the action of what he did, but maybe we could take it a step further, is that achein noda hadavar, like if he did something, he killed a man, well, he thought he was justified. He was Pharaoh's, child. He was a prince. He could do what he wants. But what is he so afraid of? Vayira Moshe vayomer. Why is he so afraid? And why in verse 15, Vayishma parot hadavar hazeh, that when Pharaoh hears this, Vayibakesh la'arog Moshe, why does he want to kill Moshe? Because Moshe killed some Egyptian taskmaster? I mean, we've all seen movies and stuff like, okay, he's the prince, he made a mistake, but that's the reason to kill him. So perhaps, Noda Hadavar, what is known, that Moshe actually is like a rebel. He's not just, it's not just that he stuck up for some Jewish guy or he killed an Egyptian, it's that he is actively violating the moral code of the society, and he is separating himself from all of them. And in fact, what might be the proof of this? That's the case. So he's like this rebel, right? He doesn't identify as an Egyptian. He actually is starting to identify as a Jew, but he's not really part of the Jewish people. He's an outsider. So he's an outsider of the Jewish people. He's rejecting his Egyptian culture as well. And it's become known that he's now like this, rebellious person. So look here what it says here. He runs away because of Pharaoh. 1 second. Vayeshev be'eretz Midian, vayeshev al ha'be'er. So this is strange language. He settles. This is not the right word. It should say he settled. I'm going to change it for you. He settled in the land of Midian and sat down beside a well. What would it be how would you have phrased this sentence differently? It should have been the opposite. First, he comes to the well and settles down there. And then after being at the well for a little bit, he says, I'm going to settle. I'm going to choose to live in Midian. Nobody picks up and says, I'm going to go live in Arkansas. I mean, nobody lives in Arkansas, but I'm joking. But and then says, oh, now I'm going to hang out by, the Clinton Library in Arkansas. It doesn't work like that. First, you go to the library, say, wow, what a wonderful thing. I think I would want to live here. So instead, I think the Torah is hinting to us here is that when it says Vayeshev Eretz Midian, he was fleeing for his life and trying to find a new identity, a new place to live. He was literally a man on the run. He had nowhere to go, right? He was running from Paro, right? Vayivrach Moshe mipnei Paro. He's on the run. He's essentially homeless. He's not part of the Jewish community. He's not part of the Egyptian community. He's got nowhere to go. And because he has nowhere to go, he ends up in Midian and he settles there. And then after he's settled, he decides to go out to the well of water. And that takes us to the third and final. So again, we see here he's struggling with his identity. And now we have the fourth episode, which is where he meets these women. So Kohen Midian, to this priest of Midian, a guy, by the way, named Yitro, Sheva Banot, 7 daughters, Vatavona, Vatidlena, Vatimleena, et Harahitim, Ashkot Zonabihan. They came and they were filling up water for their flock of their father. Vayavo Haroim Vayigarshum, a bunch of shepherds, a bunch of mean guys, a bunch of bullies come along and drive them off. Vayaka Moshe, Vayoshian, Vayishaket Zonam. Moshe rises to their defense and he waters their flock. And Batavona el Reuel Avihen Vayom Raduam Hartem Bohayom. So their father Reuel, this Kohen Midian Yitro, says to his daughters, what's taking you so long? Batomarna Ish Mitzri, this Egyptian man, Hitzilanu Miyad Haroim, Vegam Dalo Dalalanu Vaishaket Etzom. This Egyptian man rescued us from the shepherds. He even gave us water. It's a crazy story. And the rest of the story continues that Yitro says, come, why don't you invite him into our house? Bring him in. He should live with us. He's such a good man. He saved my daughters. So many people use this story to learn again about Moshe caring about other people who are not Jewish, and I think that's a good interpretation. But I think that we could actually pinpoint it and say it even differently, which is this isn't Moshe just being ethically minded and caring for the oppressed. It's that Moshe he's acting heroically, right? It's the root of nobility or bravery, right? He sees the strong oppressing the weak, and so he rises up to rescue. He's like an actual superhero. That's what's happening here. And in order for Moshe to be the leader that we know him to be, he needs all these traits. He needs to be mindful and patriotic to be of being the Jewish people. He needs to be heroic, standing up for the oppressed. He needs to be ethically minded to think about people who are outside of the faith as well. He needs to be able to create a sense of community when he runs away from Paro. He needs to be sensitive to those who are spiritually homeless to find a place. So those are all the character traits that are, in a sense, necessary for Moshe to be successful. And what's interesting is there's one other idea here that how do the girls identify Ish Mitzri Hitzilanu Miyad Haroim? They say this Egyptian man saved us from the shepherds. So Ish Mitzri, how do they know that Moshe was an Egyptian man? So one possibility, obviously, is that he looked Egyptian and he was identified. But there's a very, very beautiful and clever idea that says this Ish Mitzri saved us. Who's the Ish Mitzri that saved them? Let's go back to the beginning. Vayar Ish Mitzri Maka Ish Evri Me'achav. This entire story begins all the way back 2 days prior when Moshe goes out to see the suffering of his people. And the Ish Mitzri that really saved these women, it's like a tease. The women, the daughters of Yitro, are just telling the truth, this Egyptian man, but the text is using this like double entendre to say Ish Mitzri. It all started because he killed this Egyptian man. If he doesn't kill the Egyptian man, then maybe he doesn't go out the next day and intervene between the brothers, between the Jewish people fighting, and maybe they don't say to him, hey, we saw what you did, and he doesn't run away. So it's the Ish Mitzri itself who maybe facilitates all this, which is an incredible idea to suggest that someone out of the faith, this Egyptian man, it goes to show you how each of us have our place in the world, even if we don't always understand it, that this man literally changes all of history by beating up a Jewish man. By the way, I'm not suggesting that that gives you the right to go beat up on people because he might be a good thing down the road. I'm just pointing it out as something interesting. And the Tzur Hamor says this explicitly, that Ulafi Moshe b'shnei hayamim she'atza asa shnei gvurot, because Moshe does these two heroic acts in those 2 days. B'sham nafsho b'kapo ba'avor tzono, binyan shaya ra'ui liot ro'eh Yisrael. This is what made him fit to be the shepherd of Israel. Ulafi sheyadua de batlata zimna hava chazaka. It wasn't enough that he showed courage and heroism once, but you need a chazaka. A chazaka is something that happens multiple times, right? If it rains on you in your house in one spot and you come back to the same spot again, there's a chazaka. We're pretty sure that there's a leak in that spot in your roof. It's likely to be the case. And the Tzur Hamor goes on and continues and says so much more about how all these stories really help us understand how Moshe's key qualities arise and what makes him fit to be a leader. As we think about ourselves, I think that we can emulate many of these character traits. We can be mindful and patriotic to help our brothers and sisters. This is what we do all the time when we pray for Israel, when we support Jewish causes. We need to be thinking universalistically about the rest of the world. We need to be heroic in our decisions, and we see people being oppressed. All those are things that we can do. So how do you become like Moshe? You can start to do those things. But there's one aspect, and I want to conclude with this, that stands out amongst the rest, which is, if you really think about it for a few minutes, none of this is particularly quote unquote Jewish. There's nothing religious about this. Anybody could be moral. Anybody could stand up for his people. There's no religious consciousness here. There's no sense of spirituality. It's simply being heroic. Anybody can do this. And I think that that's actually true. I think that Moshe is a paradigm for all human beings, that we can be great like him, even if we're not Jewish. But what is the unique piece? What is the religious motivation that helps him? And so I want to show you just one other very quickly. There's a lot to say here, but one other quick thing that I think adds to this, which is the very next chapter is chapter 3. So after this whole story, Yitro and his daughters, Moshe Yaroet Son Yitro. Moshe is living in Yitro's house, and he's taking the flock of his father-in-law, and he's out there by Nahaget Atzon Achar Hamidbar, and he goes into the wilderness. Into is not a great translation, meaning he goes past Achar, past the wilderness, Vayavo El Har HaElokim Choreva, and he comes to the mountain of God in Chorev. An angel of God appears to him in a blazing fire out of the bush, and he sees that the bush is totally aflame. However, but the bush was not consumed. Let me go see what this is all about. Why is the bush not burning up? Verse 4, Vayar Hashem, God sees, Kisar Lerot, that he turned aside to look. He says to Moshe, who are you? And he says, Hineni, again, famous line. Hineni, we see it with Avram and others as well. So in this story, there's two things that I think really stand out. The first is that Moshe he's simply shepherding, but something is drawing him to Chorev, which is Har Sinai. Something is drawing him to this holy space. It almost sounds a little bit like the story of Terach and Abraham, that Terach picks up his family and something draws him to the land of Canaan. Like there's something spiritual that's happening here that takes him there. But the second thing that stands out is, why is it? What is the thing that Moshe does that causes God to appear to him for the very first time? What is the thing that he does? He stops and looks at the marvelous sight. When God saw that he looked at it, God then calls out to him. What's the possible implication here? Like, what's the possibility here? Is that this bush could have been burning for a long time, and nobody ever noticed it. People passed by and they said, "Oh, a burning bush." But what does Moshe do? He stops and appreciates something. There is this something spiritual about this moment. He has been guided here. His feet have taken him to Har Sinai, and he understands that there is something very religious and significant, something out of the ordinary that's happening here. And it's taking the time to see God in something. This is not even in the everyday. This is the non-everyday, to see God in the miraculous. That is the moment that God comes and reveals himself to him. Now, you might want to know, well, where does he learn this from? Where does he learn this ability to see God, or this religious consciousness? Where does this come from? So one last thing that makes Moshe so unique more than anybody else, besides being the greatest prophet, is that Moshe is the only person that grows up essentially in 3 different homes. He has 3 different homes that really influence who he is. We see Yaakov grows up in his own home, and then he spends time establishing a family in the house of Lavan, his father-in-law. But there's 3 homes that play a huge role in Moshe's life. His parents' home, when after he's found by Batya, by the daughter of Pharaoh, that he is weaned, his mother's milk, right, creates this national bond with his brethren, right, which causes him to save the Jewish man, right? So he learns in his parents' home, even though he was just there for a short while he was being nursed, he learns this deep connection to his people, which we talked about. When he then goes to Pharaoh's daughter's house, when he lives in the house of Pharaoh, what does he learn in that house? He learns universal morality, right, where he feels compassion for others. Who feels compassion for the other? Bat Paro, the daughter of Pharaoh herself, when she tries to literally save this child who's in this teva, who's in this ark on the Nile. She reaches out her hand and saves someone who's different from her. So he learns universal morality from there. And where does he learn this moral conscience, this religious sensitivity? He spends the rest of these days in Yitro's house. He goes to Yitro's house. What do we know about Yitro? He's Kohen Midjan. He's a priest of Midjan. But not just that he's a priest, we find out later, Chazal teach us that Yitro, he tried out all the religions. He wanted to know what was the right path. And only then does he come to God and come to Moshe later and say, I know that this is the right path, right? We see him as this religious figure. And so he explores everything. So Yitro is the one who teaches him. So what I think we see here is a number of really important points that I think all of us can do. Number one is putting ourselves in different environments where we can grow, different homes, realizing that we're in those environments and learning from those things, caring for other people, Jewish people and not, learning from other people and from people who are different than us, and obviously being sensitive to the holiness around us, developing this religious conscious, seeing God's presence wherever we are and wherever we go, and feeling that spirituality. Those are all things that we can do to allow ourselves to become a Gadol, to be great like Moshe. We might never reach Moshe's high level like we saw in that first verse, in that first source, but each and every one of us can emulate him and follow in his footsteps. And by doing so, we can achieve our own personal highest highs, so we can feel a close relationship to Hashem and follow in Moshe's footsteps. Okay, so we'll stop right